When I was about 9 years old, my mom got invited to this little church plant that she didn't even know anything about, met at my school, and the two women who invited her, two different women who invited her, didn't know that they both knew her. They didn't know that they were both inviting her to the same church. And my mom saw this in some way as being more than a coincidence, and so she went to the church. And she brought my brother and I. And at this time, she was having some struggles with her marriage, and she wasn't really knowing what she was doing with life. She had stopped going to Catholic church years before. And something that the preacher said in the sermon that day connected with her and made her realize how much God loved her. And she gave her life to Christ that day, and later was baptized in that church. And really her story and how she came to faith is a huge impact on my story, because if she hadn't come to faith and started bringing me to church, I don't know if I would have ever really connected in the way that I did. So we started attending church every single Sunday, and I began to go to Sunday school, and my best friend's parents were the teachers of the Sunday school, and my best friend's mom was one of those women who invited her to church. And I began to learn about how Jesus loved me. And then years later, at that church, we started supporting Billy Graham and one of his supposed to be final crusades. And as a youth group, we decided to go knocking on doors, handing out flyers, and then we went to the youth night. And I heard Billy Graham share the gospel. And I knew I had always believed in God, and I had always talked to God as far back as I could remember at that point. And so I gave my life to Christ at that event and went down and prayed with somebody. That was a significant moment in my life of a public confession saying, yeah, I believe this and I'm going to commit my life to it. And so for years after that, I read my Bible and tried to grow as much as I could as a Christian. In our two stories today, we see Paul, who giving his testimony to two different contexts, completely separate contexts that even religiously have different implications. And from those stories, we can learn something about how we put together our story when we have the opportunity to share with other people. So I want to look a little bit at that and give you some pointers that we can learn from Paul. The first thing I think we can see from Paul is that all words need context. Every word. It's just the way human language works. Human language works by context. You only understand what words mean and how to pronounce words and all that because humans have given those things meaning in certain times and places. And people understand those words differently in certain times and places. So that context helps you to inform you to read the language, to understand how it's being communicated to you, whatever truth is being communicated to you. This is illustrated very simply by this word. This word on screen right now can literally not be pronounced without having context around it. It cannot be said unless you put a sentence around it. So, first sentence, Johnny read the book. Johnny read the book. By having those words around it, you can see that clearly this word is meant to be pronounced read. But if you change the sentence, can you read the menu? Can you read the menu? Now all of a sudden the word is pronounced totally differently, simply by changing the context, the sentence around it. English is funny, and it doesn't really follow rules very often, and it's a conglomeration of different languages that have been put into it over time. But every language has things like this, things that break the rules, even if those languages really stick to rules. So we really do need to understand context to be able to really understand how to even just say words sometimes. But also it could affect meaning. For example, I love pizza. I love pizza. You could probably tell. But that's very different meaning than if I said, I love my wife. Same word, love, used twice, and yet you wouldn't understand the kind of love I have for pizza as being the same as the love I have for my wife. And if it was, then maybe there'd be trouble in my marriage or a weird kind of love for pizza. So you get to know what the definition is based on the context of what's being said. So all words need context. We have to fill in with context. We also have to understand that in that nature, there's a difference between the speaker and the listener, the speaker versus the listener. Because the speaker has a responsibility when they are speaking to make sure that everything they are saying can be heard by the person listening without there being any obstruction to the context. So the speaker's responsibility is to know the listener's context, to try to say what they're trying to communicate, to try to use words that would speak best to their listener. And of course, that can't be done perfectly, so there's a dual responsibility here. The speaker has the responsibility to try and communicate as clearly to the listener as possible, but the listener has to try to listen as openly as possible. Understand that the speaker is coming from a context that might be different than your own, and to try and give the benefit of the doubt to the person who's speaking. And when you're confused or when you have a word catch you off guard, that you would ask questions for clarification. Try to get more communication out of the speaker so that you can listen better. So there's this dual responsibility always going on in human communication. There's the speaker who is saying words, trying to help the listener understand what they're saying as best possible. And there's the listener trying to listen as openly and as understandably as possible from the speaker's context so that they understand what is being said. And as long as both sides of that party or that conversation are doing their jobs, then you don't have miscommunication, because both sides are seeking for the other's benefit and not only their own. Also, we need to, as Christians, understand the culture we live in. Paul understood the culture that he was in very well. You could say that Paul was as much a student of culture as he was the Bible and theology. So when he found himself in a Greek marketplace, he went looking around and he noticed the different altars they had to different gods. He read the poetry of the Greek philosophers, and he was able to quote them as he talked to the philosophers and authorities in Athens on Mars Hill. And so we see Paul being a student of culture, understanding culture, and then translating the truth of what he knew about Jesus and the revelation of God through Jesus to their culture so that they could understand what he was trying to say. That didn't make him not say truth, because he knew that resurrection in bodily form was going to be something that was off-putting to the Greeks. And yet, it was true. He was a witness to it because he saw Jesus after his resurrection. He says this in another letter. And so he himself knows the truth of the resurrection. And so he does not step back from talking about the resurrection, but he tries to give as many things as he possibly can to connect that truth to the Greek listener so that in their context they might have the least amount of obstacles to coming to know Jesus as possible. And that takes us to our final point that we really need to learn from Paul, is that we need to really know the person, right? Because if you're in relationship with somebody and you have listened to them, you have known their story, not only are you going to be able to connect your story more effectively to their story and you're going to communicate better, but you're also going to be able to be sensitive and have a trust relationship where they will hopefully also listen to you, give you the benefit of the doubt, and ask questions when they don't understand. And through that relationship with the person, you can put all these other things into work. You can understand that all words need context and be very sensitive to the context that you're in, your context and their context, the speaker versus the listener. And you also can know culture and the culture they're coming from, and then knowing them personally. And when you connect all those things in together, you can form your story into a way that they hopefully will be able to hear it, and then let God do the rest. So if we remember these things, if we focused on these things and learn these things from Paul, then whatever gospel truth has given you hope in your life could hopefully be translated to someone else and give them hope as well.